So coming back to the economy, so security concerns were there, but look at the economy. An end to the old order meant really an end of the old economic ties. We're not talking about just several decades of the Soviet period, of course. We're talking about the Tsarist period as well. So these strong roots in Russia. You have an educational network. You have social services that already existed. But now you didn't have Moscow supporting the minimum standards that it had always guaranteed, these cradle-to-grave services. How do you maintain these networks? There were other major economic deficiencies that sprang from structural characteristics of the Soviet Union. Again, they subsidized the center in some ways, but they were also major recipients. The energy grid, grain, subsidies in the form of aid for welfare. All of these things came from the center. And they were also confronted with various production and trade dependencies. You had factories with each component part based in a different republic, which is now a different country. You had the direction of trade always going towards Russia. You had all the major oil and gas pipelines going through the Russian Federation. You also had a lack of local experience in managing the macro picture. So how do you manage the economy? Well, the economy was usually run from Moscow. Tashkent arguably had more of a role than the other capitals in running the Central Asian part. But for all these, this was a major problem. You also have this economic culture of cooking the books, the full employment that shouldn't have been full employment, the underground economy, which was furthered by a lack of transparency and coherence at the elite levels in making tax and tariff policies. So it's easier to function in the underground economy if the tax system is a total mess. You'd rather function in the underground economy. Bribery and corruption are accepted as a relationship with the power, also known as vlast, power. From the police to the justice authorities to the tax authorities to foreign envoys. It's just the way it is. Corruption is what makes things happen, this economic culture. So as a result of all these things, with independence, transit costs grow. Access to markets are now through international borders, and you've got customs and tariffs, all these sorts of things. You've got restrictions on movement, but also on travel. You used to be able to go anywhere in the republics. Now these are new countries. You have industries that don't have the materials, the supplies, the spare parts that they need to actually produce what they're supposed to produce. And sometimes you can't collect on debts. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan selling their oil and their gas and to other poor republics and then demanding to be paid and not getting the money. And this happened to Russia as well. So another set of economic considerations are these foreign considerations, trying to attract foreign money. And there were high hopes for independence based on the assumed foreign interest that would be in Central Asia. And again, this was really naive optimism of Central Asian elites in the face of a major lack of capital. They didn't have money. They thought that they could depend on foreign interests, capital investments that would advance production or the extraction and delivery of things like oil and gas, minerals in Kyrgyzstan, especially gold. They expected foreign aid for the modernization of industry. They waited for foreign assistance in building institutions for rule, a central bank, military forces of their own. You needed outside expertise in these sorts of things. Gorbachev had encouraged Central Asia and other elites to pursue foreign contacts in the hope that the Union could prosper from their investment. Remember, he was all about bringing money into the state during the Perestroika period. And then he could look good for giving them independence as well. So there were some roots there, at least a couple. Like Kazakhstan had Chevron. Kyrgyzstan had a gold mining company from the west that was in. But and there were many foreigners who were initially interested in Central Asia, but this was really short-lived. Mostly because for the majority of companies, they weren't used to Central Asia ever existing. So this was partly a product of inertia. Central Asia also proved very quickly to be unstable. It was a poor investment climate. You had poor human rights policies. You had a lack of rule of law. So how do we repatriate our money? How do we bring our money home if the tax police can come anytime and take it away? So the West really stayed pretty far away, and so did others. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about potential partners later. Central Asian elites, unlike non-elites, were also really wary of foreign investment to a certain degree. They had a history of empire as subjects, and they wanted to embrace this new independence. They didn't want the independence to happen, but once it happened, they wanted to embrace it, and they wanted to take advantage of it. Ultimately, though, they were very disappointed in the role of foreigners in economic growth. which led to very cautious efforts to move back towards Russia, where the quote-unquote natural market is. Remember, all roads leading back to Moscow. But there were also concerns of sovereignty, which were still important, which sort of tempered this relationship. Another major issue that post-Soviet elites in the republics were dealing with, now independent states, were how to carry out effective foreign policy making. Again, they kind of flirted with this before, but they were never actually in charge of diplomacy. And state building is external as well as internal. You need to secure your borders, you need to gain recognition on the international stage, but you also need to compete in the global market. Foreign policy was, again, yet another sphere where they had no real experience. The largest foreign ministry in 1992 was in Kazakhstan, and they had 30 employees. So the foreign ministry was a little office. Foreign policies had previously been uniform. They'd been outside of their control. They'd all stood together also, to gain or lose together. But they all had the same foreign policy. All of the republics had the same foreign policy. Now you've got increased competition for friends in the outside world. Uzbekistan's flirting with Turkey. Kazakhstan says, well, wait, we want Turkey as well. Then there's China, there's Russia, there's the U.S. The more they pursued their self-interest, the more they rubbed up against one another. And so these were brothers now turning enemies. And you had increasing degrees of conflict between these Central Asian states. They were all looking for military allies. They were looking for trading partners, for investors. They were competing for status. Uzbekistan, the most populous Central Asian state. Kazakhstan, the one with the most oil, the largest by territory Central Asian state. The Kyrgyz, the most beautiful and most democratic Central Asian state. All of them were pitting themselves as something. At the same time, you had the dominance of Russia in this post-empire world, which led to resentment. But then again, this resentment was tempered by the understanding that they really needed Moscow's participation, especially because there wasn't a lot of other interest coming from abroad. So by and large, Central Asian states found overwhelming disinterest from abroad, except for Kazakhstan. And the only reason Kazakhstan didn't was, yeah, there was oil, but the big thing was their nuclear weapons. They were the heir to Soviet nuclear weapons, and so they became a participant in disarmament talks. The next issue is nationalism and the Russian problem. Elites signed on to these mildly nationalistic agendas at the beginning. They went back in time to find adequate elements of nationhood and then alter the state in ways that could accommodate these. Again, these new holidays, the statues, the national symbols, everything that I talked about when we were talking about nationalism. So after independence, nationalism was really manifested in several ways. The titular language became the official one. You had major affirmative action for the titular nationalities. You had the rebuilding of mosques, the upgrading of religion. You had, as I mentioned before, renaming streets and towns, reconsidering the past. Under the Soviet Union, nationalism among these groups differed from titular elites versus non-titular elites. Titulars used nationalism to keep their privileges. Non-titulars had used nationalism towards the end of the 1980s to gain privileges that they otherwise didn't have. Often, non-titular groups struggled to get the center on their side, in other words, Moscow, guarantees of some degree of autonomy, for example. And the center could always use this as leverage with the republics. Look, you've got the Karakalpaks demanding greater autonomy here within the Uzbek Republic. You guys should stick with us, and maybe we won't give them so much autonomy. Upon independence, of course, the relationships frequently changed, with non-titulars facing a new center. And the new center was at the republic level. Now the capital of the republic was their new center. And this was where the republic titulars were. And so sometimes in desperation and fear, they sought their own independence movements. That's why you find ethnic conflict in breakaway regions. Central Asia has much less of this, perhaps because power was held so tightly. So, for example, the Karakalpaks have no chance of doing this at all, or very little chance. But the threat that came from Tajikistan showed just how this was a reality, potentially. So, a big question related to nationalities was the Russian problem. Russians dominated the leadership of major state institutions throughout the republics, such as the Border Patrol and the army units. Almost half of the enlisted soldiers in these territories were actually ethnic Russians. But Russians also held key economic positions, the factory managers, the state farm administrators. They held a disproportionate share of the skilled labor. They completely dominated certain areas. So for Central Asians with independence, they feared a major brain drain. And this often did happen. They had questions about the loyalty of those who remained at the same time. This was an especially big problem in Kyrgyzstan, where Russians made up around 22% of the population, and especially in Kazakhstan, where Russians made up about nearly 40% of the population. So in Kazakhstan in particular, this was dangerous because the concentration of the Russian population was along the northern border, which would make it so easy for the Russians to come and annex, right? Just like the Germans came into Czechoslovakia in 1930, what was it, 1938, before World War II, and they took that area, which had a large German minority, or a large German population. So this was dangerous for foreign policy as well. It was another foreign policy question, which we didn't address a second ago. This was less of a problem in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, where Russians were less than 10% of the population, but still the Russians there held critical positions. And there was open concern from Moscow, where nationalism became very strong in the early 1990s, especially in 1993, with the victory of Vladimir Zhirinovsky in the parliamentary elections, or strong showing, I should say, not quite a victory. So Russia proper was increasingly interested in the Russians in what they called the near abroad, the former republics of the Soviet Union. And there was, in fact, a movement out of Central Asia by Russians as well as other Slavs. About 25% of the 1980s Slavic population, or about 3 million people, had left by 1996. So the Slavs were moving, and with them went some of the expertise that the Central Asians needed to run their own states. Remaining Russians tended to huddle together. Sometimes they enjoyed newly acquired civil liberties from the post-Soviet period. Other times they appealed to the international community as a repressed minority. And all of this left political elites trying to balance nationalism with a practical need for Russians, and the fear of appearing vindictive on the international stage, which would lead to the greater threat of Russia proper coming back down south. Which, again, the Russians had demonstrated in Tajikistan by putting a presence there, that they were prepared to put their troops back out if they needed to. So they tended to make Russian language an equal status, for example, or the language of inter-ethnic communication, though it wasn't necessarily an official or state language per se. It was allowed to exist. So in Central Asia, unlike the Baltics, the elite sought to actually demonstrate that they wanted Russians there. Now in the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they actually tried to push Russians out. So this was a big difference. Now, all this involved a real balancing act. Political elites tried to balance nationalism, again, with the practical need for Russians, so they had to make some concessions. They had, for example, nationality-based quotas during elections, so they had a minority representation. They had greater recognition of the Russian language, which I just mentioned, which is really important because when you look at the number of Russians who spoke the titular language, it was miserable. About 1% of Russians in Kazakhstan spoke Kazakh. Around 4 or 5% of Russians in Uzbekistan spoke Uzbek. And also remember, the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, the Turkmen, and the Tajiks are also a little bit wary of losing Russian because this is an international language. It's the language of elite exchanges. It's the language of the technical fields. It's the language that everything is published in. It's the language of culture. So you have these increased ties, economic, political, and military cooperation with Russia. They also allow people to have dual citizenship with Russia. Now, going back and looking at the Soviet legacy. Oh, take this in a new set. Hold on.